So welcome everyone, and I'd like to particularly welcome James Oliver, a new Associate Professor in the school. James is both a design researcher, and he'll talk about his own research, I'm sure, as well as a person who has a very strong history working in areas like PhD supervision. And the reason for inviting James is that I think each of you has the both potential but also interest into moving into areas of design research, whether that's a PhD or moving back into industry with a more robust and rigorous research agenda. So James, I will let you take it away.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to meet you all, virtually at least. My name is James Oliver, as Marius just indicated. Like everyone in the world, I have an accent. My accent is not from Australia, it's from the Hebridean Islands, which are in the northwest of Scotland. So I'll try and speak slowish and not get too excited and carried away, because it can sort of string on. So please do just go, oh, James, I don't know what you said. Please feel free to ask me to repeat myself. Yep, so I'm from a little island called Skye. I grew up in a bilingual community with the Gaelic language. And I also grew up in a sort of land context where we had the equivalent of native title, if you like. We called it something different, it's called crofting. But effectively since 1886, it was native title protected land. So we grew up as kind of a different kind of community within the mainstream Scottish society. I guess internationally, that might be referred to as words like native, which are more or less appropriate depending on the context, or indigenous, and islander, and First Nation, all these different words that are used around the world. So the reason I'm mentioning that is not to like identify myself as such, although that is important. And certainly if you're doing research, it is extremely important to situate yourself in the research that you're doing. So in Australia, we also know that acknowledgement of country is a really important thing. So I also say that in acknowledgement of that there are First Nation people on the land that I work on now, the Boonwurrung and Wairong people. So as always, I acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. But situating yourself in research is really important, because research is about relationality, if you like, between things. So when you're doing a research project, you're bringing things into relation with each other. Not into a true relation, as if there is only one relationality between them, because there's so many variables in the world, but we have to try and make sense of that variability, of the complexity. That's why we do research. Well, that's one of the reasons anyway. That's one way of explaining it. And certainly, it's not as if I'm going to come up with the most succinct and perfect explanation of what research is, but I've been doing it a long time. To go back to my narrative of where I'm from, the only reason I started doing research was because in my youth, I encountered a few anthropologists who came to our islands quite a lot in the 80s and 90s, and were doing research on us. So I was like, well, I'd rather be telling the story of my culture instead of all these other people coming in from outside. So I guess I was quite politicized about what research is quite early on. So I did an honours degree in history and politics, and then I did a master's by research degree on the philosophy of social science and research methods, and then I did an anthropology PhD. But all the way through that line, it was a kind of cultural inquiry that was constant, even though I was going crisscrossing across disciplines. the cultural inquiry kind of remained the same. It was about social identity, how people related to place and to policy and to education systems, and also how people can revitalize their own sort of social context, even reappropriate culture for themselves. So those are common kind of themes across Indigenous studies and research, but they also sort of resonate with any kind of research that's oriented towards human experience and human realities and human difference, and not even so much difference, but the density of human experience and social relations being at the heart of a research problem. So long story short, I finished my PhD in 2002, I think. So my PhD is now 18 years old. It's an adult. And since that, in that time, a lot of that time I've been working, I moved away from social science and been working in art schools and design schools, running PhD programs and research training. So, and the beauty of, I think, RMIT School of Design and the College of Design and Social Context is that it has a very sort of eclectic and open approach to what creative practice is as research and what design is as a creative practice that produces research. It's one of the attractions to me in applying for this job, and very glad I also got it. So I've got fairly long-standing interest in the relationship between, I guess, social and cultural inquiry and research as a practice, where you produce experiences and artifacts and or some sort of not necessarily textually mediated way of producing knowledge and or ways of knowing. And probably in terms of creative practice and research, ways of knowing is one of the more critical dimensions and aspects of research, as opposed to producing knowledge as if it's fact and fixed and given and just has to be discovered and extracted. Research can get quite complicated and even dangerous and damaging if you approach it as an extractive exercise. So I guess in some ways, at a PhD level, you're in some ways, and master's for that matter, any higher degree oriented towards research practices, part of it's just about unlearning other practices you learn in the university as well, of just mining literature for data or like extracting information from surveys. And not that these are wrong or bad things, they just have to be contextualized and situated in greater degrees of complexity. Because ultimately a PhD and or peer-reviewed research is going to have this very, it's much more about it being deep and meaningful rather than trying to be generally homogenizing of the world, or trying to make out that human experience is uniform, and therefore you need some sort of simple utilitarian solution. And that's been a criticism of design, of course, over the years, a particular utilitarian perspective that has dominated through certain practices and products, etc. But of course, designers, like any other person in the world, is aware that, well, the world is not so simple. So that's just a bit of a preamble. I'd actually like to know, well, firstly, is there any questions? Is there anything you want to ask me? And you can maybe do that by way of introducing yourself also. But I'd really like to know what your interests are and what you're thinking in terms of your own research project. And it doesn't matter if you have aspirations to do research beyond the component in your master's, but I think it's always important to have an understanding of what you are aspiring to in terms of your degree and your research. And is that okay if I ask you that? Lots of nodding. Maybe. So
It might be best, James, if you called on people and they might be able to respond, because they'll all be really polite and sit there quietly.
okay, well, so I have don't feel picked on, because there's a certain grid order in front of me. And I think, Steve, you look like the person who might be the first person I'll ask, if you don't mind.
Lucky me. Yeah, I guess I recently moved to Malaysia last year. My wife is lecturing in the local university here. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sort of in this situation at the moment where I've left my career on hold in Australia and, you know, focused on this course here over the next few months. And so basically I'm dedicating every day to this at the moment, which is quite good for a part-time course. But what I have found is with this extra time, it means my scope for this is probably quite wide, and I've had time to read a lot more than I originally planned for. And so I found myself actually going down the rabbit hole of philosophy and its relation to design practice and research, particularly object-oriented ontology from Graham Harman. So that will most likely be the focus of my research project. A component of that is I'd like to extract some of the concepts within that and apply it to a physical design, as well as explore some of the other concepts. So I think at the moment I'm probably looking at a couple of outcomes, a couple of deliverables from this project. One will be an essay that's in 3 parts, and as well as a creative practice artifact. And along with that would be a workbook with all the process.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, relationality is obviously a very big factor in what you're interested in there.
Yeah.
And next we have, sorry, like I said, I'm peering now because my eyes are so bad and this screen is so small, but Adiba?
Hi. I'm going the other way. So I was in Jordan for the last 10 years, and prior to that I was a communication designer, freelance. And in Jordan I had the job of being a project manager in a educational textbook context, and did this course at the same time, and juggled family. And I wish I had all that time that Steve had. But I kind of just, well, yeah, it'll be just really great because then you can really delve into things more deeply. But so I moved back to Melbourne just recently, and in that, back in Jordan, I also ran what would you say, historical tours between Jordan and Jerusalem, and just looking at the different ways of connecting with different cultures in a more interactive and experiential type way. Mm-hmm. So then I came back to Melbourne and just trying to work out how do I bring all these things together. And what I wanted to look at was my research project is about multiculturalism going into interculturalism, and looking at what, especially with youth, and just looking to see how we can move forward in Australia towards interculturalism, if that is the answer, because we're looking more towards cultures mixing together more and learning from one another rather than just being compartmentalized, and also looking broader and including white Australians in that multicultural mix rather than it being us and them. So I just like to have a big zoom out in terms of we're all here together. We all learn and interact with one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great. I think next we have Ali. Is it?
Hello.
Hi there.
So my research is looking at data humanism and participatory approaches to visualizing complex data. And I'm kind of working in reverse in this unit because I start a PhD in July, and that's looking at participatory approaches to designing with data around climate communication. And so I'm kind of doing like a very, very, very small version of some of the things that I've proposed for in my PhD application, and working with some scientists on some science communication data viz problems, and looking at how participatory approaches can improve the relationship between designers and scientists.
Great, thank you. Thanks. And Alicia?
Hi. I am currently working at 2 universities in Sydney in transitory kind of transition pathway, foundation level for one university and diploma level for another university, teaching a lot of international students. And I am really interested, when I started this kind of process, I was really interested in helping them overcome barriers to learning to make their experience more beneficial and meaningful, because I actually noticed when I started working at the second university that I was seeing students that I taught at the first university, and I thought this is a problem because they'd already gone through that first program, sometimes twice, and then I was seeing them again at the other place, like at the diploma level, and I thought, what's happening? You know, why are some of these people kind of looping the loop a few times to get through here? And so that was kind of a point of piqued my interest. And since doing my kind of literature review and looking through things, I've started to focus on, at first I thought I was thinking about doing, because I'm teaching design, so thinking about doing it for design students in the classroom, but then I've since noticed and found out that actually I probably should be augmenting their psychosocial kind of support systems as opposed to academic systems, because one of the main reasons and barriers to kind of learning is actually mental health and stress. So I'm kind of looking around those kind of support systems and thinking about, one, identifying what's happening there. Is there the correct system, or are they not seeking help efficiently? So that's the kind of area I'm interested in.
Great, thank you. Kim?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, I arrived 2 seconds late and your name doesn't show on the screen. What's your name, sorry?
Sorry. Kim, I'm James. I will let you settle because you've missed obviously the other part. I'll come back to you in a minute. We're just going through everybody.
I got a large part of your introduction. It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. No, your background was fascinating. And so it makes me excited to ask some questions. So I started off with a background in law. I did economics and political science undergraduate, and then went into law in Melbourne. And then I guess within my studies, I always had an interest in cooperation, social progress, equity, big topics like that. Probably always a bit too big. I practiced law for 3.5 years, including at a social enterprise law firm, and then at Environmental Justice Australia. And then went into design about 4 or 5 years ago, working with business and government on innovation projects. And loved the agency it gave me, the ability to be creative, and the framework for guiding change. I guess because I'm interested in social progress, change is one way to get there. And so my interest in this program is evolving, but I've got a strong interest in education and learning, And so I've been really taken by Richard Buchanan and Nigel Cross's reference to design as a third culture of education, or a learning culture. And from my experience, design has been often a learning process because it's always novel and collaborative. And so I'm interested in, my current paper is systems orientated and transdisciplinary design practice for education within sustainable futures. So some elements of that could include the premise that creativity, empathy, and civic-minded imagination is needed to address our systems issues. Design can provide a culture of learning to deliver action-orientated and experiential learning. How do we work with STEM educators within a often objective, positive, empirical paradigm to try and insert design, creativity, empathy, different epistemological paradigms within education? That's a big theoretical kind of angle, but obviously we have more practical research focus. Or another question, line of inquiry could be, with the online education revolution, how can we ensure that the essential qualities of empathy, creativity, social awareness are not lost in the solitary, often solitary ways of learning in the online context?
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Good stuff. So now we have Jim, is it? Can I see that right?
Yeah, it's Jim James, yeah. So yeah, I've got a similar name to yourself, but I'm known as Jim usually. And I come from Northern Ireland originally. Yeah, my area of study really and research relates to my work, because I've been balancing doing this course with full-time work. At the minute I work for Transport for New South Wales, but I've done quite a bit of work for both federal and state governments over this past 5 or 6 years. And really my area of interest is really how do you balance, or how do you work with the constraints of working with government? How do human-centered designers work with the challenges and constraints of government, both from a practical or a practice level, but also from a personal level as well, because it can often be a very difficult domain. So what is it that people use to actually get them through that? Very often things don't work out. How do you pick yourself up, move along? What do people use? And what do people use for, you could say, self-protection almost as well? How do they remain resilient in the face of these challenges? That's what I'm particularly interested in.
Cool. Thank you. Cheers, Jim. And Susanna.
Hi there. Can you just tell me specifically what the question is that we're all speaking to?
What your research project interest is, basically.
Okay. Thank you. So my research project interest is in transition design and leadership, and how do we prepare ourselves, our organizations and people to equip themselves with the capacities they need to meet the challenge of what I'm calling this time between worlds, or this time of transition. I'm interested in a transdisciplinary approach that combines horizontal learning and vertical learning in order to prepare people for the leadership capacities that they need to meet the challenge. So my inquiry is, how might we integrate horizontal and vertical learning into one transformative learning experience that will really make a difference and build a tipping point in how people meet the complexity challenge of this time.
Thank you. And Priyanka, are you there?
Yes.
Hiya.
Hi.
Hope you said your name right.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Hi, I'm Priyanka. I live in Mumbai, India. And this is my last but one unit into the master's. So I'll be finishing my project next from March onwards. So throughout the master's, what I really enjoyed is how one unit has fed into the other, how everything connects with one another, and how one framework that could be business related feeds into something else completely, which is seemingly not connected. And striking a balance and establishing harmony are the two main takeaways that I have so far gathered from my master's in whatever you do. So there's this principle called Ikigai, which is a Japanese principle of finding the purpose in life. I used that as a launchpad to define what I was interested in doing as my research project. But there are three main things that I'm really interested in, which is consumer delight, achieving business goals, and sustainability for fast fashion brands. So that's some area that I'm really interested in working on. And through the literature review, I observed that currently consumers don't get rewarded for good practices, or there's no real connection between brands and consumers. And could that be used as a problem point to launch some innovative service or some retention or loyalty program in order to retain consumers and get back to fast fashion, but in a sustainable way? So there's that tension and paradox created there. That's my area of interest.
Great. Thanks, Priyanka. And I think there is one more person, Stephen. It's a different Steve, is it?
Yes, hi. Excuse me.
Hi there.
Sorry to only make a partial appearance into the meeting tonight. Yes, okay, so I am an American by birth and have been an Australian, living in Australia for 13 years and Australian for, I believe, at least 8 or 9 of those years. I've been working primarily for the last 7+ years in what is effectively a service design area in the recognition and incentive space. My company develops programs essentially to enable people to thrive at work through forms of recognition and incentive that are self-generated and self-motivated and things like that. Over the course of this time, what we found is, and what I'm finding is in general in our society, is that almost universally all services and just about everything is being administered, or is at least a touch point, is going to be through some sort of a digital infrastructure. And so the digital infrastructure and the space around that is going to, how that infrastructure is structured is going to facilitate whether or not there's going to be justice going into the future for marginal people, for people who are minorities, or people who traditionally have been locked out of services or been locked out of society. With the digital infrastructure basically transforming how society interacts and even what society is. The digital infrastructure platforms going forward need to be inclusive and need to have inclusivity built into them. And so part of what I'm doing in this program is because I'm quite interested in how the infrastructures and the social structures are starting to more or less overlap and intersect with each other, and how effectively the design of, let me see if I can, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Service is becoming basically what you can facilitate to deliver digitally. Because I think that's kind of what we're moving into in the future. So anyway, that's where my interests are, and my research ideas are around things like inclusivity in the public square, the digital public square.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Stephen. It's great to hear from you all. An eclectic range of interests, which is wonderful. So another part of my background is that I used to run a centre called the Centre for Cultural Partnerships, and it ran a master's program, 2-year masters, for people who had some sort of professional background like yourselves, and were interested in questions of social practice in the context of creative practice, to be as broad about it as possible by what we meant by cultural partnerships. So art and community, or some sort of social or creative intervention and engagement, and going back to Adiba's language earlier, very much about trying to bridge that relationship between, you know, top-down multicultural practices and actual on-the-ground intercultural possibilities. So the diversity you're bringing in front of me here is kind of nice to hear, that there are other degrees that hold that kind of space of diversity in terms of interests and practices. And I guess you're doing a master's called of Design Futures, and futures is a very interesting word. It posits the notion of possibility, I hope, for you. And really, I mean, that's what research is about. Research is about possibility. Although I was criticizing anthropology earlier, I do refer a lot to anthropologists, and there's a guy called Tim Ingold and a woman called Elizabeth Hallam, who wrote a book about creativity. One of their key arguments about it is that creativity is a way of sort of reading the world forward in an open way, so that possibility emerges, or that you can see that there is not just one narrow, predetermined or overdetermined outcome. I think it's also important to think about research in that way as well. I personally like to think of research as a technology, and in particular a technology of the imagination. So I guess I encourage you to, you know, embrace your imaginations and creativity when you're coming up with a research project, and that it doesn't have to be A, your life work, or B, you don't actually have to prove anything, but you do demonstrate how, you know, different, let's call it, information and data and analysis that you bring together produces a new way of thinking about things. And again, that word new or original can be quite confusing or confounding. In reality, it's really just about the honesty that's in your research. There's, you know, you have rigor when you're getting information and data and literature together, and you acknowledge that prior information and you bring it together in your own unique way. And that's really what makes your work original. It doesn't have to be a brand new idea, but it will be different the way that you bring it together. So I just want to emphasize that in terms of, you know, the relationship between research and imagination and creativity and possibility, particularly because, I mean, I'm saying it in those terms because I was asked to nod to the idea of practice as research in the context of what you might do next with your research trajectories. So maybe, I mean, I'm conscious that it's not a very long period of time we have. So is there any questions anyone wants to ask right now, or interrogate me about? There must be something. Yep, is that, I can see a hand waving. Kim?
If someone has something more particular to their research that might serve the group, feel free to say, but what are your reflections on the state of arts education and creativity in education in Australia? I heard that the federal government has reduced funding to arts and design, and how do you, from the way to value it more in the evidence, or the I don't even know where I'm going with this, but that's obviously a huge focus of your interest.
Okay, that's fine, I can work with that. So in a sense, what you flagged there, and a couple of you in different ways flagged something similar for me. When you're figuring out what so I'm just going to like come back to this research methods class, although I'm completely happy with that kind of question, absolutely. When you're coming up with a research project and a proposal, and then executing the research, one of the difficult things is how that's problem of scope and scale. I think, Kim, you might even have mentioned that earlier. You know, how big ideas, how do they become more concrete? And, you know, Adiba, again, that's a big question you're interested in. And quite often, it's very easy to have a sense of what the context of our interest is, the context of the problem. Can be a little bit more difficult getting the situation of your research articulated. So this is my way of talking about it, but I think that might be quite helpful for you to think about, okay, you've got a context of something you're interested in, like, you know, multiculturalism, how can it be more about interculturalism? Well, there's not going to be one answer to that. Likewise, okay, there's a huge funding problem with the education sector and arts and public pedagogy and et cetera, but there's not going to be one answer to that. So within that, you're going to have a situation that can be addressed in a more concrete manner. So that's when I was talking earlier about bringing things into relation. So there's various variables, there's various factors that come into play, whether it's policy or population or prior research or all of these things, and you can hone a situation for yourself. And in terms of practice-based research, there's another dimension where you're actually much more able to put yourself in the middle of that as well. And I don't mean it has to be about biography and an autoethnographic thing. I mean, you can actually be part of the control situation. So it could be about your job. So you can, the relationality of the problem can be made more clear because you put, you know, yourself at the middle of a problem. Okay, so what are all the factors that make my job difficult within that bigger context? So that's kind of what I mean by the difference between there being a context for the research and then the actual research situation. And then when you have the research situation, now I'm going to be much more explicit about design and not about my more generic interests. I'm a methodologist, really. I'm not a professional designer as such. I am in the sense that I'm working in design school, but I also prefer to call myself transdisciplinary. But you've probably all come across this or something like it. Yep. So this sort of like characterization of a wicked problem is once you've, you know, articulated your situation, then this is actually a useful framework or there's other frameworks, of course, but that's a bit of a template to start with, to then deconstruct that situation even further. And the reason I would recommend those kind of practices is so that you, I think, I can't remember which one of you earlier, you talked about how there's a sort of overwhelming of information and literature and ideas, a master's or a PhD project, even a book, even a whole policy program. These things fundamentally fail to deal with all of the complexity. So you do have to have a sort of find a way to easily come to an end point of your thesis. The research probably won't have an end point. So you do need some sort of structure in there and understanding difference between things like context and situation, between feeling and actual substantial evidence for an articulation you might want to make, or an experience you might want to reproduce, or even if it's a unique experience, if get people involved in it. How's that going to happen? What's going to be familiar? What are people going to recognize? So a really important part of research is the relationship between, there's another way of talking about what we've just talked about, is that relationship between language and methodology. So you have to be very consistent with your language. And that's about describing the context and the situation. And you have to be very clear, and that's also through language that's not just text. When we talk about methodology. So how are you setting up the situation for other people for it to be legible, for it to be sensible to their reading and or interaction with and experience of it, etc. So that's a bit of a long-winded sideways answer to you, Kim. But also just because I wanted to keep it on the method.
Yeah, that was more helpful than I anticipated. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, anybody else? Anyone got, I mean, feel free to talk about your own particular issue. Not that you have an issue, but you know what I mean. Susanna.
I have a question because I feel like this conversation is part of my research right now. It's like part of my first person self-reflective practice. And what just came through to me as you were talking on many different levels is, and I'm curious, because is the piece around language, which back to Jim, I feel like working in public systems, working in any system, it's like the amount of time it takes to build that background of relatedness, that shared language, particularly if we're doing looking at a transdisciplinary approach. And I'm wondering if you can speak at all to that, given your background. How much, I mean, that in and of itself could become a PhD focus. I'm realizing it's like, how do you build shared language? Because without that, you can't really be effective. I don't think you can necessarily be effective without some kind of shared sense of an organizing structure in the language we use, in how we define the language we use, not just in our speaking language, but in our ontology. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that as a dilemma and how you've approached that.
Well, to pick up on your use of the word ontology, when we're dealing with systems, particularly those that are basically manifesting an institution or a policy, we know we have very pervasive ontologies that come out of those spaces, such as productivity, such as progress, such as even well-being, I guess, in some ways. And these are, they're not bad concepts per se, but they're very overriding concepts, and they can be self-defeating, I guess, in many ways, which is probably why you're interested in the problems that you're flagging. I mean, I guess with you and Jim, what is interesting about your question is that it's the master's, the master's project that you're doing could be a way of safely dealing, or at least exploring some of those questions that you don't need to explicitly deal with and upset anyone at work about at this time. And it could be a way of testing what is possible in terms of maybe a PhD project, or maybe some sort of consultation that you want to bring into your work at a later date, to much interrogate those systems, and particularly the interpersonal human consequences of certain systems and language. I mean, system is a language, and language is a system as well. And these things can become in a negative loop. But look, what I would say is, I would encourage you to think of a research project as a way of going back to the idea of imagination, a way of reimagining what might be possible. You're not actually turning your world upside down. You've got this safe space between the however many words you start and end the project with, to explore some difficult questions. I mean, they can all be quite a difficult and an emotional experience, because research is an embodied experience, and that is your whole being and psyche is involved in a research project. So whether it's about multiculturalism and its sort of legacy and the negative side of that, or whether it's about institutional bureaucracies and etc. Research can be a safe space, I think, to explore some problems. And I worked for the Scottish Government for 2 years, setting up positive mental health and wellbeing program based on arts participation. And that was a collaboration between 3 areas of the Scottish Government, which was the health sector, the prison sector, because they were interested in recidivism, and culture. And we were based in the Arts Council, and we had to come up with this strategy for promoting positive well-being through arts participation, which we did. We came up with a strategy and a policy, and we came up with a funding program. And as soon as that was all achieved, it just felt very much like a tick box exercise, because all that happened was that the language we produced, so this is back to the point about language, which was about here's another piece of language, mainstreaming ideas of participation and well-being into arts programming at the government level. So we succeeded in that, but did we actually systemically change? Did we make arts more inclusive? Did we make the public more trusting of art spending? Did we make people stop committing crime after they left jail, etc., etc.? There's a lot of cynicism around these programs, and I think and I'm not saying that to diminish at all what you're talking about, meaning it seriously does need research done on it, and it seriously does need action type or ethnographic type research done on it. And I'm sure there's stuff out there already, but it's good to have insiders doing it. I think maybe that's what I would encourage. So your master's might be a safe way to explore the safest way for you to go about that. I don't know. But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm just saying, if we can't speak the same language, we can't have, how do we expect to have any impact? And there's so many different, if you want to work transdisciplinarily, the very first thing is you need to have some kind of shared language, because already I can hear you talking about concepts that I can relate to, but I have a completely different language for that. So until we're all speaking Spanish together, unless there's unless everyone's multilingual, it's very hard to be effective in a transdisciplinary way. So I'm really curious about how much time gets invested. I'm interested in the collaborative piece around how you build transdisciplinary communities to solve complex problems, because I feel like it's all necessary. Everyone's piece of the puzzle is necessary.
Isn't the interesting thing about design and other creative practices is that it's kind of about experience. Whereas I think language is always going to be limited. And language always, there's a famous philosopher, Wittgenstein, the limits of our language is the limit of our world. And going back to my point about creativity being read by those anthropologists as a forward open thing, their point was that it keeps growing, or it keeps evolving and emerging. Culture is dynamic, it evolves. language is part of that. So language is not something fixed and pure and perfect that we just have to know where the top of the pile is and then count it all up. It's always going to change and have different meanings across different spaces. So with design and artistic practices and creative practices and material and spatial practices, that is already transcending language, because it's about the experience, the materiality of experience, but it's also, and particularly with collaborative and participatory practices and other mediated forms, also then that brings in intersubjectivity. So that relationship between experience, embodied experience, and intersubjectivity is, there's a strength there in, I'm reluctant to say design research, but research in the space of design and design practices, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, just talking to Susanna's point, I think that language is perhaps even more important than that. Language is power, I think. Particularly if you think in the world of government, it's all about the world of language and how people describe things. The science fiction writer Ursula Guin, I think she's called, had a wonderful short story called The Word for World is Forest. And she actually came from a background in anthropology as well, and her parents were anthropologists. And that's a really great story. I think that in many ways, in our modern whatever it is, the word for world is business, and particularly in government, there isn't any other language except the language of business, and we really need to investigate and maybe interrogate that. Is there a better way to look at things and interrogate things? And again, it's, as you say, Susanna, it's that gulf perhaps of understanding between people whose word for world is business. There's nothing else. They know the price of everything, the price of everything and the value of nothing. And perhaps other people who value other things, like perhaps the natural world around us, human condition, whatever. So maybe that's something to investigate further.
Absolutely. I think, again, with my research methods hat on, it brings me back to this point about the difference between having a context of a problem that you perceive and then being able to situate it as a practical research project that is actually achievable. And it's not, I mean, I completely agree with what you're both saying about the relationship between language and power and how we understand the world. And that manifests in many, many different ways. So the key thing for you is, so practice-based research, it's also about what your practice is. It's not about this ideal of what design is or art is or different versions of those things. I mean, they're very modern concepts in a way anyway. There's human practices in terms of human-centered design. It's human practices that are at the heart of what we're interested in. So if you're doing a practice-based kind of project for your own research inquiry, that's situating, you as the embodied researcher. Comes down to your own experience and your own actually acknowledging the limits of your world, because actually having limits on things and boundaries on things is a good thing when you want to specifically talk about a way of knowing something or what a particular piece of knowledge is, because otherwise it will just sound too big and too vague. And yeah, I hesitate to say too political, because I'm completely down with research being political. But at the same time, how do you have impact and not alienate? Because so in research, there's a distinct difference between the normative data that we may have all around us and what's called substantive data that you can evidence through your research. And the normative is just I mean, in some ways, the normative it's not bad. It can be talked about as a bad thing. Normative research happens all the time when people are just doing a regular design practice, the kind of stuff that they need to gather information and data to do something. The everyday taken for granted knowledge we have, but it's very prone to confirmation bias because people just select or surround themselves with the kind of information and data they want. So again, the difference between, when we're trying to deal with big problems and trying to situate from the context is about getting much more substantive, let's call it evidence, and how that's brought into relation directly to the particular problem you have or your question you're trying to address. So that's the first steps of rigor. And again, that connects back to that originality point about the honesty in your research. It's not just it's not a vague or a normative statement. That it has to be backed up. And that's when anyone's assessing your research, for example, whether it's a PhD being examined or whether it's an honours essay, well, I might agree with what you're saying, but you are in no way proving that you really know why or how you came to those ideas. Not to dumb it down for you guys, but there is that. But there's always that pressure to just demonstrate that you know how you got to where you say you've got to.
Can I ask a quick question on that? Would you encourage us then as aspiring rigorous researchers to become educated in statistics or quantitative research methods, or qualitative research methods even as well, to the point where we can not bias towards subjective constructive, and be able to be a bit more plural in our methodologies and epistemologies?
Well, again, it comes down to the situation of what kind of practitioner you want to be and what is your professional context. Without a doubt, I mean, one of the unhelpful binaries in everyday life, never mind university, is this qualitative, quantitative one. Going back to the point about the world's a business, that business world is obsessed with quantifiable outcomes and metrics. The university has, consumed that way of being as well. But the flip side of that is the so-called subjective often gets erased. And the problem with dismissing subjectivity is that you flatten the world, as if there's this flat ontological space, which is completely untrue. It might be normatively true for the majority of the population, but what if you are on First Nation territory and haven't had access to the same infrastructures as other people? Because it's just assumed that, oh, well, there's a school there, of course you're going to go to it. So, the point being, different outcomes depend on the situation. So there's nothing wrong with having a larger set of skills. Doesn't mean it's always right to apply them. Just like a mixed methods research project doesn't make it a better research project. It's more about the depth of knowledge that is people have an opportunity to engage with, and that connects with. So we talked about earlier, I think, like normative, substantive, and analysis. They're like basic things that are going on with research, but in terms of like the kind of information you might produce as knowledge, but the further you go along the research trajectory, and particularly in a PhD, you're actually expected to add levels of interpretation that demonstrate understanding. And there is always going to be a subjective quality to the research you do, because you're a person doing it. and if it's practice-based, then you're also a person doing it in a very material space, not an abstract mathematical space. So there's a few articles that I can share, which some of you may or may not be interested in. One, they're different. One is an introduction I wrote about practice as research for a book like a year or so ago. Another is actually about this idea of situatedness and this conflict of objectivity, subjectivity. And it's called Situated Knowing. And it's actually by a scientist who's critiquing that binary, Donna Haraway, or at least she's a philosopher of science. And then there's another article, I can't remember now exactly what it's called, by Dwight Conquergood about radical research, basically. So anyway, they're all different, and they kind of probably build in the conversation we've just had in different directions, but explicitly, I guess, oriented towards, well, thinking about what rigor may or may not be, thinking about what practice may or may not be in terms of producing ways of knowing. So I think they might be quite useful. They resonate with various things you've been talking about. And like with any piece of literature that you get, usually, you know, as you do your research projects over time, you'll find that, you know, one piece of advice I always give people is that learn to write things out of your project. So you get new information, and there's this tendency to, you know, pile everything on. Oh, I've read this now, and I've read this, and it can be a bit confusing. But over time, you sort of learn to write that out, and, you know, park things and make it as a footnote, etc. But I think it's one of the beauties of, even if you're reading things that you think, oh, I'm supposed to have read that, and you don't like it, so like you find a way of dealing with it and not ignoring it, because people always know if you've ignored it and it's something really important and famous. But what is really useful with any piece of literature is the bibliography at the back, and just, you know, so even if you are not that interested in these 3 things I send to you, do also scan the bibliographies of them, because I think in that, going back to the relationality of ideas, and there not being a linearity between problem and solution, you'll find your own sort of relationality with practice as research, or design research, or whichever particular language you want to build to describe and articulate your own research project.
James, thank you very much. I'll leave you off the hook now, because you've done a fantastic job of covering a really expansive range of ideas. The good news for us, of course, in the Masters program is that James is part of the school, and we have been luring him in to work with us on various levels of the Masters. And so this is not the only time you'll come in contact. And I think you can all appreciate the value of thinking, but also the sort of clarity around how you might construct these things, like the research project, plus if you're interested, further design research and further study as a PhD. So that's going to be really valuable for us as we move forward. Talking about moving forward, we are meeting next Wednesday for those of you who are moving into the project. And I think, again, this is a really good stimulus for those ideas to jump them from the methods into the project itself, for those of you doing that. For those of you who are sort of new and early stage, we will have this opportunity again as we move across the program to connect with James and pick up more of those ideas as we go. So thank you very much.
Feel free to share my communications details, etc. It's all good. Marius, will I just email you the chapters I'm talking about, or will I put a link onto Slack or what?
Look, you could throw them up on Slack, and I'll have a couple of new channels next week for the research project. But in the methods group, I think it's probably useful to have them coming up in those channels. That'd be great.
No worries. Pleasure to meet you all. Thanks for sharing your interests and aspirations. I wish you very, very well, and maybe see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Cheerio.
Bye.
Bye-bye.